Welcome back to the channel. My name is Jeff, and today, in honor of continuing October or Shocktober, I'm going to be talking about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. This book was famously conceived one summer when Mary Shelley, then Mary Godwin, her lover Percy Shelley, her future husband, and the famous Lord Byron gathered in Byron's place in Geneva in 1816. 1816 was the year without a summer. What had happened the year before is this Indonesian volcano named Mount Tambora had exploded, kind of like Krakatoa. But I think Krakatoa had happened before recorded history, I guess. But it was the most violent volcanic eruption in recorded history, I think is what they said. And so much dust and ash were put up into the atmosphere that the summer following was super cold and dark. And it was really, especially in Europe, it was very unlike previous summers. So Mary Godwin and her lover and Lord Byron were up at his place in Geneva, normally a probably sunny, beautiful place. But this year, not so much. So they were indoors most of the time. It was rainy, it was cloudy. So they were reading, I think they were reading German fairy tales, German ghost stories at the time. Reading them and spooking each other. And then I think Byron's idea was, hey, why don't we go around and let's each come up with an idea. A story to tell, a new story to tell, and we'll present it to each other in this round, in this format. I don't think Byron came up with anything. He may have come up with a few lines of poetry which he baked into another one of his poems. Percy Shelley wrote a fragment which later became the story, The Vampire, which was then taken by his physician, this guy John Polidori, and turned into a story. I don't think it was a novel. I think it was a story, maybe novella, which was kind of the progenitor of the Count Dracula-ish vampire stories. I'm sure there were vampire stories before 1816, but this was kind of the beginning of maybe the gentleman vampire that Stoker made so popular. And then, of course, Mary Shelley came up with the idea of Frankenstein. So it's fascinating that it's possible that Dracula and Frankenstein were both conceived. Obviously, Frankenstein, yes, but the germ for Dracula was also conceived during this summer of volcanic darkness at Lord Byron's place in Geneva. So there are two versions of Frankenstein. The one I read is the 1818 text when it was first published. So she conceived of it in 1816 and then 2 years later published this version of it. She went back later on and did a George Lucas in 1831. I think she had lost two children. She had children that had died and she had grown older, obviously. She was 18 when this was published, by the way. And she made some changes to the new 1831 version. And the 1831 version is the one that's most republished. I think recently now, Oxford has an 1818 edition, now Penguin does, but before that, every edition of Frankenstein that was out there and that most people probably read was the 1831 edition. So the changes that I read about a little bit, they were subtle. But Elizabeth, who's kind of his paramour in this, in the 1818 version is his cousin. And, back in the day, cousins and no one really whatever. It's like just have babies that don't die in childbirth and we're all happy. But in the subsequent 1831, I guess the mores had changed in society a little bit. Elizabeth became someone else. I think she was someone taken in by the family, so there were no blood relations, right? So there was that. She introduced the idea of electricity into the 1831 book and did not exist in this book. In this book, the creation of the monster is really just, the creature. I'm probably going to flip back and forth. I don't want to say monster because there are connotations to that I don't think do justice to the creature itself. In this edition, Victor's motivations for creating the monster are not super dramatic in that they're kind of more realistic in that he goes away to school. He learns about all kinds of new science and gets excited about it, and then kind of stumbles upon, oh my God, I think I can recreate life purely out of ambition. Like, I think it's a thing I can do, so I'm going to do it. And I think in the 1831 version, I scanned it, really, I couldn't find the passage, but I think Shelley went back to give him a little more motivation for doing it, maybe one that's played into more of his childhood, because his mom dies when he's very young. And I thought, boy, even when I was reading this, I thought, wow, his mother died when he was very young, and maybe that's going to be something that it's a little more cliche, right? That no one's going to die on my watch. That would be the thing, like I'm going to make people not die. Hello, Anakin Skywalker. But it's not, she doesn't connect that, which is kind of very sophisticated of her, I thought. It's just pure ambition. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. All that is to say that she made some changes to the 1831 edition versus the 1818. But I'll be talking about the 1818 edition. So my overall impressions, I'll kind of do a spoiler, non-spoiler, I guess. I guess this will, I don't know, I'm going to kind of mix it up. Spoiling a book that was written in 1816. I don't know. I don't feel too bad about it. A classic, anyway. The one thing that, I read this years ago, and I remember liking it, but it didn't travel with me, and that I don't have any deep. I do remember that there were parts of it that were very boring, and that I found the dialogue between the creature and Frankenstein really interesting, but nothing really stuck with me. Upon this read, I was kind of bored by the first third. But once the creature dialogues and Frankenstein dialogues start to happen, I was really floored by them. I thought they far outweighed, kind of the dull lead up in a sense, in a way. So that was really amazing. And one thing, which I confronted right away is that our cultural understanding of Frankenstein really comes from the movies. There were movies before the James Whale, Boris Karloff 1931 films. There were a couple of silents. But that film really is indelible. It's a really good film in its own right. For a horror film for the 30s, it's an amazing movie. But it's a whole different animal than the book. There's a little bit of the, what have I done? But the monster really is kind of monstrous, although in the Boris Karloff one, he is kind of sympathetic, but nowhere near the level of how sympathetic the monster is in Mary Shelley. It's amazing. But I think culturally we've been robbed by these adaptations, and I think it's so easy to come along to a work like this one and to say, oh, he's a monster, he's running around, huge, strong, killing people. And that's the thing that gets taken and used. It's kind of what happens when a really good film is turned into a franchise. You think of something like Jaws. The first Jaws film was phenomenal. Really, really good. It was a good movie. And every Jaws film that came afterwards, all it did was figure out how we're going to make the shark scarier and make things jump scare. They took the sensationalist shell upon which Jaws was made and reproduced it with nothing inside, ad infinitum. I feel like First Blood was the same thing. The first Rambo film, First Blood, was a really good movie. It was just a good, solid drama, albeit with action movie, things attached to it. But it was about something. There was something underneath there that was real. But everything that came after First Blood was crazy Stallone blowing people up. And it was a shell. Everything was a shell afterwards. And I feel like the same thing has happened here. Everything that's been taken from Frankenstein, that's been put on the screen, has been sensational, So I was very kind of delighted to get back into more of a gothic novel, but it's more than the sum of its parts. Like there's more to it than that. It's got depth. It's a really good literary novel in its own right because it has something to say. So I was very surprised and delighted at that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the story. I think we all know kind of the basics, but this novel is told very much like Dracula, which came much later, as a series of letters. And it's kind of nested, right? So we start off in the Arctic, where we begin to read a letter by a sea captain named Robert Walton, and he's narrating how up in the Arctic he picked up this, guy, this wastrel, who was, I think, in a boat or on a drift out there, and it turns out to be Victor Frankenstein. He brings Frankenstein on board, and Frankenstein then tells his story, which Walton records in these letters back to his sister. So you have the first layer, which is Walton, then the second layer down, which is Frankenstein's story, and then during Frankenstein's story, you're going to get the story of the creature, when later on, after the creature's been created and he and Frankenstein meet up on several occasions, the creature then narrates what has happened to him kind of off screen, which we didn't see. So it's this weird nesting effect. And it ends up, the last letter of the book is Walton's last letter to his sister, and how everything ends. So it's that's the structure of it. Basically, what's happening is the first maybe third of the novel is the story of Victor Frankenstein. And it's funny, I really find that Frankenstein is very, very unsympathetic. I think he's the villain of the book, of the movie, right? See what happens? He's very much the villain of this book, and the creature is kind of an anti-hero in a way. I'm stretching things for sure, but that's kind of how I look at this and how the gut feeling of it is. So, he loses his mother when he's very young, and then he sees at one point when he's young, he sees lightning split a tree. And something about that moment really kind of shocks him into I want to learn all about these forces of nature. So he begins to read the medieval writers who don't really have much of a grasp on science, kind of the natural scientists, guys like Albertus Magnus, so on and so forth, who were just, kind of making shit up, the alchemists, right? And so, fueled by this desire, he winds up going to Ingolstadt in Germany to study real science with the Germans. What happens here is he's very good. He shows up, he's immediately kind of chagrined because these real scientists tell him, who these books you're reading, these guys, they didn't know anything. We're going to show you what real science is here, son. And so he begins to study chemistry and all the things associated with the sciences of the, early 1800s, and gets very excited about it. And so goes into it full. And he's very talented, and his instructors even tell him. So as he does this, he's starting to notice that, there are possibilities here. And one of them that fascinates him is the spark of life. What creates animated matter from inanimate matter? And it's oh my God, I want to do this. And he figures out, this is a soft science fiction novel in that Mary Shelley kind of had a notion that, science is being done. She didn't really know much about science in general. I don't think she did any real research. So I would consider this a soft science fiction novel. Just in a brief aside, kind of my theory is that Poe leads to Verne, leads to, the hard science fiction of the day. Shelley leads to Wells and the soft science fiction. And the difference between the two is that if you read Poe's story about, it's either one of his longer stories about a balloon flight is filled with altitudes and atmospheres. I mean, he got a lot of stuff wrong, but he took the science of the day and he put it in the story in a real sense. He did the same thing with the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, which I just reviewed on my channel. There was a whole part of that book that he took from real naturalist reports of the day and put it in the novel, trying to get as much realism and then extrapolate on that realism to his fantastical elements. And then Jules Verne kind of took it from there, and Verne was very hardcore about that. And if you read Mysterious Island, which I also reviewed on my channel a year ago, all the things, basically Mysterious Island is, there's a mystery, but it's more about how kind of five guys create civilization from nothing. But everything they do on the island is possible in the science of the day. How they create fire, how they do domestication of animals, how they build things, how they make all these things. It's all true. It's all real. Verne knew the science of his day to within an inch of his life. And then the few things that he throws on top to make it speculative are very plausible. That leads to guys like Arthur C. Clarke, the guys who were physicists, Gregory Benford, the hard sci-fi, right? And then Shelley she wants to use quasi-science or notions about scientific things to really hold a literary metaphor about creation and creator, which she does in this novel to wonderful effect. And to me, H.G. Wells does the same thing. Wells was not a hard sci-fi writer. Wells was a soft sci-fi writer. And to my mind, the comparison here is Verne and Wells both wrote books about man going to the moon. For Verne, how they get there is ballistics. So Verne figured out gravity, how powerful a gun would have to be to actually shoot a shell to hit the moon. I think he came pretty close from what I can tell. But again, what he's extrapolating is how we actually got there in 1969. by shooting men ballistically, in orbit, and then we got there. In Wells' story, they discover the substance called cavorite, which possesses anti-gravity properties. And they slap cavorite on this thing and it floats to the moon, right? Soft science fiction. But Wells is doing it more for literary effect. And I haven't read From the Earth to the Moon, which I think is the Wells story. But again, so to back it back into Shelley, I think this is the beginning of what I consider soft science fiction, probably the first one. Because I think her and Poe came maybe a little bit after her. So I think she maybe even inspired him. But anyway, blah, blah, blah. All that is to say that this was, it's a very soft sci-fi take on, creation in that way. So the funny thing about this is, again, to harken back to the cultural perceptions of Frankenstein, we're all used to it's a dark and stormy night, Frankenstein, heaves the monster up on this platform to the top of the dome, which opens up, right? And he waits for lightning to strike, and it galvanizes the creature, and it wakes up. Not so in Mary Shelley's book. Basically, you're told that Frankenstein, he went out and got pieces, put them all together, did some science and some chemistry, and then at one point, the monster's eyes open. It's very anticlimactic. I was like, man, I don't remember this at all for good reason, right? So, and it's kind of a very anticlimactic moment in the story. It's like not with a bang, but with a whimper that this creature is created. So the creature opens his eyes, wakes up. Victor freaks out, and he's like, oh my God, my creation is so ugly and distasteful and repugnant to me. Turns around, bolts, runs out of the room, goes somewhere, passes out for a while, comes back, the creature's gone. And now we're done for a while. Like from there, he goes about his life. It's like, I think it was just a huge mistake. Not thinking like, I created this being, it's out in the world somewhere, what the hell am I gonna do about it? So again, from that moment on, Victor's really very, very unsympathetic because he just doesn't care. He doesn't care what he did. He doesn't want to find the creature. He doesn't feel a responsibility towards it. And in fact, the creature confronts him, which I'll get to when I talk about the creature. The creature confronts him a couple of times to basically say, hey, you left me hanging here. I got nothing, and everybody thinks I'm horrible. I can't get love or companionship or any of the things that you've endowed me with the potential for. You got to help me out here. And he's like, no, you're evil and I don't trust you and you're going to do these horrible things. And no. So he's just a dick, really. He's just created something and then flagrantly decides to neglect it and abandon it in a really horrible way. And I'll read something near the end of the book when he's in a bad way. He's talking to Walton on board the ship and he's trying to kind of justify what he's done. And this is what he says. That in the last moments of my existence, I feel that burning hatred and ardent desire of revenge I once expressed, but I feel myself justified in desiring the death of my adversary, who's the creature. During these last days, I have been occupied in examining my past conduct, nor do I find it blamable. In a fit of enthusiastic madness, I created a rational creature, and was bound toward him to assure, as far as was in my power, his happiness and well-being. This was my duty, but there was another still paramount to my attention. The duties towards my fellow creatures had greater claims to my attention because they included a greater proportion of happiness or misery. Urged by this view, I refused, and I did right in refusing to create a companion for the first creature. He shewed unparalleled malignity and selfishness. In evil, he destroyed my friends. He devoted to destruction beings who possessed exquisite sensations, happiness, and wisdom. Nor do I know where this thirst for vengeance may end. Miserable himself, that he may render no other wretched, he ought to die, period. And okay, so that's the end of the day. Now, there's some argument to be said because the creature does not respond well to utter rejection by his creator. Okay, so that's kind of my interpretation of Victor. Really not the best guy. The creature, however, is amazing. An amazing creation of Mary Shelley's, frankly. I think, in a way, not since Milton have you had a incredibly articulate, quote-unquote evil character in literature. I mean, I haven't read a ton of the the things that came before the Gothic literature. I haven't read a ton of Gothic. I know there's Melmoth the Wanderer and the Monk. I know there's some kind of sketchy characters somewhere in some Gothic literature. So they may be, but the creature is extraordinarily erudite, and his depth of feeling is profound. So I don't know that there's anything on the level of this in those earlier novels. So anyway, there's the undramatic creation scene. The creature's created. He wakes up, his creator sees him, runs in horror out of the room. He doesn't know what to do. He bails, takes off into the countryside. So we find out later on when he meets back up with Victor Frankenstein, he explains what he's been doing and where he's been. And he basically runs and hides. At this point, he can't read, he can't speak. He's very, he's mute in a sense. And he hides out in this hut. And the hut is adjacent to this little shack that contains this family called the DeLacy family. And he winds up, opening a little hole between the two. So he just sits there for months at a time, observing this family, which is kind of smart on Shelley's point because, as a child, so much of why children acquire language so quickly relatively to other species, right? They're talking 2, 3, 4. Is that they're observing and hearing language all around them from the minute they're born. They're observing language, they're observing things spoken, they're observing objects being labeled and that kind of thing. So she creates something similar, which is, again, to her point of this being kind of a quasi-science fiction novel, this is kind of a plausible way a being would learn how to speak, how to communicate with another species in a way. And he's been made out of pieces of, human beings. So you sense that there's some innate ability already there, right? So he watches this family speak to each other, but he's not a cold, analytic being. As he's learning things, he also starts to feel a tremendous need to be loved or to be connected to them in some way that's more than just him looking at them. So he begins to help them in these ways where he sees them chopping wood for the fire, so he'll go out and chop a bunch of wood and put it on their doorstep. And so they become aware that there's some benefactor, hiding out and helping them, and they don't sweat it. And so at some point, they get a visitor, and the visitor, Mary Shelley creates this whole convoluted story about what happened to this family, which I won't spoil. But the visitor that comes doesn't speak French, and I guess they're in France at this point. So the creature learns English and French by watching the family teach this woman how to speak with them, which is, again, very clever that she did it that way. That she could have easily just said, this creature was created out of beings who already knew how to speak, so we could speak straight away. But she throws in a little bit of a quasi-scientific method here, which is kind of cool. So the creature learns how to speak because they have to teach this visitor how to speak their language, which I thought was neat. But at a certain point, he's just like, oh my God, I love this family. I want to be part of it. He feels warmth and tenderness towards them. All these feelings that were created in him. He experiences the full range of human feeling. But he's scared to death because he knows what he looks like. He's hideous and he's afraid. So one day the kids go off and do something, and the old man is left there and he's blind. And so the creature's like, all right, I got to risk it. So he goes and he has his conversation with the old man. He's like, hey, you're the one. I've known about you. I can sense that you've been around, and thank you so much. And, and he's like, oh man, this is it. I did it. And then the kids come back and they basically chase him away with rocks and sticks and, don't ever come back again. And they freak out and the creature's drawn off, Forlorn and miserable. Think about all the times in life we've been rejected by a person, maybe a woman or a man that we've come up to, that we're sweet on, and we've been outright rejected, or maybe parents have rejected us in ways that are, traumatic that we carry with us to this day. So it's traumatic rejection. He's hiding out in the woods, and he knows he can't be seen anywhere. Comes upon this young girl who's drowning in a lake, saves her life. But people come upon him as he's dragging her up to the lake, and they look at him and they think, oh my God, he's trying to kill her. They shoot at him. He takes a bullet, So here's a creature who's just like, there's no hope for him. He's driven to rage, and he kills a member of Victor's family in order to kind of draw Victor back to Geneva. And finally, Victor comes back, and then the creature arranges a meeting, and they finally get together. He confronts Victor, and Victor says, quote, "Begone, vile insect, or rather stay that I may trample you to dust. And oh, that I could, with the extinction of your miserable existence, restore those victims whom you have so diabolically murdered." So the creature says, quote, "I expected this reception. All men hate the wretched. How then must I be hated, who am miserable beyond all living things? Yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature, to whom thou art bound by ties only dissoluble by the annihilation of one of us. Your purpose to kill me. How dare you sport thus with life? Do your duty towards me, and I will do mine towards you and the rest of mankind. If you will comply with my conditions, I will leave them and you at peace. But if you refuse, I will glut the maw of death until it be satiated with the blood of your remaining friends." End quote. And further, quote, "Remember that I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel," referencing Lucifer, "whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed," which wasn't true of Lucifer. Lucifer disobeyed God. That was his misdeed. But the creature is kind of blameless here. "Everywhere I see bliss, from which I alone am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Makes me happy. Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous." Be gone, be gone. All this. So he's just abhorred. And what the creature is asking him is to make him a mate. Make me a female of my similar character, as ugly as me, as large as me, as strong as me, someone who's a companion, so I can be with. And then she and I will leave humanity, and we'll go find some uninhabited place to live out our lives, right? And so in a sense, Victor doesn't trust him. But it's in a way, it's Victor's own ambition that poisons him. How could he ever trust it? It's like he can't even really love, frankly. I think his ambition has hollowed him out and made him kind of this dead creature. And to me, he's the villain. He's the dead creature inside, where he's all about. And now, unfortunately, what's happening is the thing that he's created, which is part of him, has killed a bunch of people in his life. Because the creature's sort of like, unless you help me, I'm gonna hollow you out. And I think that's the metaphor of this book that Shelley's getting at. That like the birth, the things that come from our unabashed, unthoughtful ambition will eventually destroy us. Because those will be the things in life that will take us over. And little by little, they will kind of cleave us away from the things that we love and move us away from all that's good in life, until all that's left at the end is this continuing overweening ambition to do more and go higher, and we'll be hollowed out creatures, right? So it's this wonderful metaphor, and she splits it in half. She kind of personifies Victor's ambition in the creature. So, the creature's misdeeds and the creature's evil is kind of really birthed from Victor. And the fact that Victor won't help it makes perfect sense, because in a sense, he's so suspicious and mistrustful of this thing that's born out of him. You know what I mean? Like that's how kind of craven he is as a person. That he refuses, and this bullshit excuse he comes up with, like I didn't trust that the creature would go away because of all the terrible things it did. It's like if he could lead with kindness and love, the creature would follow in kindness and love. But he can't conceive of that he could do that, right? So it's wonderfully complex when you start thinking of it in that way, which is kind of my take on it. And the creature at one point kind of comes to understand what it's become, that it is an embodiment of Victor's ambition. Okay, so here's the creature talking about kind of it's come to understand what it's become. After the murder of Clerval, which is Frankenstein's best friend, I returned to Switzerland, heartbroken and overcome. I pitied Frankenstein. My pity amounted to horror. I abhorred myself. But when I discovered that he, the author at once of my existence and of its unspeakable torments, dared to hope for happiness, that while he accumulated wretchedness and despair upon me, he sought his own enjoyment in feelings and passions, from the indulgence of which I was forever barred. Then impotent envy and bitter indignation filled me with an insatiable thirst for vengeance. I recollected my threat and resolved that it should be accomplished. I knew that I was preparing for myself a deadly torture, but I was the slave, not the master, of an impulse which I detested yet could not disobey. Yet when she died, nay, then I was not miserable. I had cast off all feeling. So he kills someone very close to Victor and beloved, and then kind of crosses over now. I was not miserable. I had cast off all feeling, subdued all anguish, to riot in the excess of my despair. Evil thenceforth became my good. Urged this far, I had no choice but to adapt my nature to an element which I had willingly chosen. The completion of my demoniacal design became an insatiable passion, and now it is ended. There is my last victim. This is after he kills the last person that he's after. And then, this is his last kind of self-condemnation. You who call Frankenstein your friend, he's talking to Walton now, seem to have a knowledge of my crimes and my misfortunes. But in the detail which he gave you of them, he could not sum up the hours and months of misery which I endured, wasting in impotent passions. For whilst I destroyed his hopes, I did not satisfy my own desires. They were forever ardent and craving. Still, I desired love and fellowship, and I was still spurned. Was there no injustice in this? Am I to be thought the only criminal when all humankind sinned against me? Why do you not hate Felix, who drove his friend from the door with contumely? This is one of the kids in the DeLacy family who drove him away the first time. Why do you not execrate the rustic who sought to destroy the savior of his child when he saved the child in the lake? Nay, these are virtuous and immaculate beings. I, the miserable and abandoned, am an abortion, to be spurned at and kicked and trampled on. And even now my blood boils at the recollection of this injustice. The creature has the arc. Victor ends up in this novel still unrepentant, thinking I did the right thing, the creature was bad, I don't regret anything that I've done. The creature at the end of the novel completely repents everything and recognizes that what else was I going to do? I was driven to insanity and madness and evil by this creator of what I've done. So there's a wonderful arc and realization. And in a sense, the creature's recognizing that I can't go back. All I am now is evil rage. And so I'm gonna do the right thing, and I'm gonna head up to this mountain and create a fire, and I'm gonna jump in, and I'm done. Which is wonderfully noble, because he recognizes he's damned. It's Greek tragedy. I mean, this novel is really Greek tragedy. It's not a monster novel. It is not a Victorian Gothic. It is absolutely profound Greek tragedy on a very high note. Just kind of summing up, I really appreciated this novel on so many levels. The language is wonderful. Shelley can really write, no doubt about it. She's a wonderful, from the quotes, hopefully you've gotten a bit from the quotes that I shared. She's a wonderful writer. And I think her prose is even a bit more red-blooded than her Gothic contemporaries, from who I've read so far. And it's wonderful that she decided to imbue a genre with literary ambition and literary qualities. And I wanted to read her preface of this novel, because she has a wonderful paragraph in which she defines why she chose genre, in a sense, and why it is something to be chosen, right? So this is Mary Shelley's preference to the 1818 edition. Quote, "The event on which this fiction is founded has been supposed by Dr. Darwin and some of the physiological writers of Germany as not as of impossible occurrence." Sci-fi, right? "I shall not be supposed as according the most remote degrees of serious faith to such an imagination. Yet, in assuming it as the basis of a work of fancy, I have not considered myself as merely weaving a series of supernatural terrors, to my mind, which separates her from her Gothic contemporaries. The event on which the interest of the story depends is exempt from the disadvantages of a mere tale of specters of enchantment. It was recommended by the novelty of the situations which it develops, and, however impossible as a physical fact, affords a point of view to the imagination for the delineating of human passions, more comprehensive and commanding than any which the ordinary relations of existing events can yield." Right? So to my mind, what she's talking about is, you can't write a realistic novel about one human being creating another, because it's not realistic. But she wants to get at these ideas of ambition and creation. So you're either going to write a rewriting of Adam and Eve, you're really going to make it supernatural, and she's going to write the fall of Adam, which is a purely supernatural event, to get at these ideas. If you're writing a naturalist novel, maybe later on it's Dr. Moreau, where he's creating creatures who are kind of literate, and there's a treating on some of those themes there, but they don't rise to the height of the creature in this book. So what she's saying is, by using the idea of genre, of these ideas of like, this could possibly happen. It's not a wand. What she's saying is the plausibility factor here is what gives the literary ambition scope and power. Where, yeah, it's possible you could write a similar novel about Frankenstein coming across scrolls of magic and then imbuing Frankenstein with magic, and you could probably have a similar dialogue. But I wonder if it would have the impact because of the idea that Frankenstein's ambition and created it with the means of scientific. I don't know. There's some magic pixie dust there that makes this work, and I think that her argument is, because it's plausible, it allows her to write it in a realist way, and then also treat on these themes, which make it larger than life. Which is what I love genre. Which is why every once in a while, a genre novel will be written that gets elevated above their brethren. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is, to me, a literary novel about good and evil, and it says very profound things about the nature of evil and mankind's ability to refuse it. In a way, it's a wonderful novel. Obviously there are films and there are things sometimes that stand above their genres because they take on literary themes and they imbue it with the seriousness of art. And then there's the other 90%, which is a lot of fun, monster movies and what have you, right? But I love that she talked about it and kind of expressed, in a way, when I finished this book, and I'm like, man, she wrote the hell out of this theme and she wrote the hell out of this book about this creature, and there it is, her kind of recognizing as such. So yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I would highly recommend. I don't know. I mean, you could read the 1831 novel versus the 1818. I don't think, but there was really something wonderful about this version of it that was very raw and clean, and maybe, I don't know, maybe the cleaned up elements don't give it as much power later on. But it's definitely more than the sum of its parts, to be cheesily metaphorical about something that's more of the sum of its parts in the book. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed my take on Frankenstein. I'll see you next time.